Imagine this for a moment. You're in a relationship with someone who claims to love you deeply, passionately, endlessly. They speak about commitment. They speak about care. But when life collapses on you, when you're exhausted, confused, desperate, they're nowhere to be found. No reply, no presence, no reassurance. They vanish exactly when you need them most. If a human did this to you, you wouldn't call it love. You'd call it manipulation, neglect, or emotional absence. And yet, billions of people devote their lives to a God who appears to behave in exactly this way. That contradiction is where the mind begins to fracture, because on the surface, divine hiddenness feels like abandonment. It feels cold. It feels unfair. It feels like silence where comfort should exist. Most people stop there. They decide God must be cruel, indifferent, or imaginary. But a man from the 16th century, someone who studied power with surgical clarity, would tell you that this silence is not a failure of love. It is its most calculated expression. Machiavelli would look at this complaint and say, "You're misunderstanding power itself. You're assuming that presence equals care, that visibility equals commitment, that constant reassurance equals strength. But power does not work that way, and neither does the human mind." Here is the first brutal principle Machiavelli understood, long before psychology gave it a name. Familiarity destroys reverence. The closer you are to something, the more ordinary it becomes. The more accessible it is, the less weight it carries. Think about the beginning of any meaningful connection in your life. The early days are electric because of what you don't know. The pauses, the uncertainty, the unanswered questions. Mystery doesn't weaken attraction, it creates it. But over time, as everything becomes predictable, as every habit is exposed, something subtle dies. Not because the person changed, but because the unknown disappeared. Machiavelli watched this happen not in romance, but in courts and kingdoms. Rulers who tried to be loved by becoming overly accessible lost authority. Kings who explained themselves too much were mocked. Leaders who made themselves constantly available were slowly stripped of awe. Distance, he observed, was not cruelty. It was architecture. Now apply this logic upward, beyond human relationships. Imagine a God who appears every morning in your kitchen, commenting on your coffee, offering advice on your emails, correcting your small decisions. At first, you'd be overwhelmed, then impressed, then comfortable, and finally bored. Reverence would rot into routine. The infinite would shrink into the familiar. Divinity would become background noise. Machiavelli would say this plainly. What is always present becomes invisible. Power that never withdraws erodes itself. Mystery, on the other hand, preserves authority. The moment you fully understand something, you begin to judge it. You start noticing flaws. You believe you could improve it, but what remains partially hidden stays elevated. It stays beyond your grasp. And what remains beyond your grasp continues to shape your behavior. This is why the hidden God fascinates where a visible one would exhaust. A God who communicates through fragments, through intuition, coincidence, moments of clarity that arrive without warning, forces the mind to engage. You search, you interpret, you question. And in that search, something profound happens. The relationship stays alive. Modern psychology would later confirm what Machiavelli intuited. Uncertainty intensifies attachment. It doesn't weaken it. The human brain is not designed to bond most strongly with what is predictable. It bonds with what is intermittently reinforced. This is why randomness is addictive, why slot machines are powerful, why people become obsessed not with those who respond instantly, but with those whose attention feels scarce and unpredictable. A God who answered every prayer immediately would eliminate faith entirely, because faith is not belief in what is obvious. Faith is engagement with what is uncertain. Remove the uncertainty, and you don't deepen belief, you kill it. Machiavelli would see this as strategy, not neglect. He understood that engagement depends on tension, that devotion depends on mystery, that authority depends on restraint. A visible God would be like a person who is always available, always agreeable, always responsive. Reliable, yes, but weightless, predictable, easy to take for granted. A hidden God, however, demands interpretation, and interpretation creates meaning. Here is the deeper layer most people never consider. Machiavelli believed that true character is only revealed when people think no one is watching. The moment surveillance enters the picture, authenticity dies. Actions become performance. Morality becomes theater. If God were visibly present at all times, every good act would be contaminated by awareness. Every kindness would be transactional. Every moral choice would be distorted by the knowledge of being observed. People would behave well, but not because they are good, because they are being watched. A hidden God creates the only environment where genuine morality can exist. When you choose honesty without certainty of reward, that honesty is real. When you help without knowing if it's seen, that help reveals your nature. Absence becomes a test, not a flaw. Machiavelli understood that the strongest leaders sometimes step back, not because they are weak, but because withdrawal forces others to grow. Strategic absence reveals capability. Constant presence breeds dependency. This is the opening truth you must sit with. God's silence is not emptiness. It is pressure. Like gravity you cannot see but constantly feel. Like a king who rarely appears, not to punish his people, but to ensure that when he does, his presence still bends the room. The hiddenness is not the absence of love. It is the structure that allows love to remain powerful. Now here is where Machiavelli's insight sharpens, where the blade actually touches the bone. He understood something that still makes people uncomfortable today. Uncertainty does not weaken commitment. It intensifies it. The human mind does not attach most deeply to what is stable and guaranteed. It attaches to what must be pursued, interpreted, and earned. Modern psychology later gave this a name: intermittent reinforcement. It is the strongest behavioral conditioning mechanism we know. It is why gambling destroys lives, why social media hooks attention, why people obsess over signals instead of certainty. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain stays alert, engaged, hungry. When rewards are constant, the brain relaxes and then disengages. Machiavelli would look at faith through this exact lens. If every prayer were answered instantly, clearly, unmistakably, faith would collapse into mere observation. You wouldn't believe. You would verify. And once belief becomes verification, devotion turns mechanical. The soul stops reaching. It starts expecting. A God who is always visible would reduce the sacred to a schedule. Divine intervention would become customer service. Miracles would lose their meaning because meaning depends on rarity. Scarcity creates value. This is not cruelty. It is structure. Think about relationships again, because Machiavelli always grounded power in human psychology. The person who replies instantly, every time, becomes mentally backgrounded. They're reliable, but they don't occupy space in your mind. The one who appears inconsistently, sometimes close, sometimes distant, creates tension. That tension pulls attention inward. You replay conversations. You interpret silence. You invest. A visible God would be predictable. A hidden God keeps the mind active, searching, interpreting, engaged. And engagement is the true foundation of any lasting bond. But Machiavelli would push this further. He would say, power is not only about keeping others engaged, it is about preserving authenticity. And authenticity cannot survive constant observation. Here is the uncomfortable truth. If God were always visibly watching, every human action would be compromised. Kindness would become strategy. Generosity would become performance. Morality would become compliance. You wouldn't be good. You would be obedient. Machiavelli obsessed over this question in leadership. How do you know who people really are? His answer was simple and brutal. You observe them when they think they are unobserved. Only then do you see character without costume. A hidden God creates the perfect laboratory for truth. When you choose integrity without certainty of reward, that integrity belongs to you. When you resist temptation without fear of immediate punishment, that restraint is real. The absence of surveillance makes virtue meaningful. This reframes divine silence completely. What looks like neglect is actually trust. Trust that humanity can act without being forced. Trust that goodness can exist without constant enforcement. Trust that growth requires space. Machiavelli wrote extensively about strategic withdrawal. He believed that sometimes the most powerful move a leader can make is to step back, to let others struggle, to let others reveal themselves. Not because he doesn't care, but because over-involvement breeds weakness. A constantly present God would create spiritual dependency. Like a parent who never lets a child fall, divine micromanagement would stunt moral development. Humanity would remain obedient but small, safe but immature. A hidden God, on the other hand, forces humanity to develop its own moral muscles, its own discernment, its own courage. Silence becomes the gymnasium of the soul. And here is the paradox Machiavelli would smile at. Absence increases the impact of presence. When someone who is always available gives you time, it feels normal. When someone rare shows up, it feels significant, weighty, earned. When a hidden God breaks through a moment of clarity, a perfectly timed coincidence, an answered prayer that arrives when you least expect it, the impact is magnified. It doesn't feel routine. It feels intentional. Machiavelli understood this principle deeply. A ruler who appears too often loses gravity. A ruler who appears selectively becomes unforgettable. But there is an even deeper layer beneath all of this, one most people never consider. What if divine hiddenness is not only about power or psychology, but protection? Imagine encountering infinite power directly, infinite knowledge, infinite presence. Would your mind survive it? Would your free will remain intact? Or would your individuality collapse under the weight of absolute certainty? Machiavelli might frame it this way. You don't stare directly at the sun, not because the sun hides, but because your eyes cannot endure that intensity. Distance is not rejection, it is mercy. Perhaps God remains hidden not because he is absent, but because full exposure would annihilate the very autonomy that makes relationship meaningful. Love requires separation. Choice requires uncertainty. Identity requires space. This transforms the silence into something radical. Not abandonment, but restraint. Not indifference, but discipline. The kind of discipline only true power can afford. Machiavelli would recognize this instantly. Real power does not beg for recognition. It does not explain itself endlessly. It does not flood the room with noise. It remains confident enough to be silent. And here is the shift you must feel now. If this logic applies to God, it applies to every domain of power. leaders, institutions, relationships, even yourself. Those who make themselves constantly visible dilute their influence. Those who maintain mystery preserve it. Those who trust enough to withdraw create space for growth. Divine hiddenness is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working at its highest level. And once you see that, the silence no longer feels empty. It feels intentional, like a chess player pausing not because he has no moves, but because every move is being calculated several turns ahead. And that realization should unsettle you, because it suggests that what you thought was absence might actually be mastery. Once you understand this, Machiavelli's logic starts spilling out of theology and into everything else you recognize as power. Because hiddenness is not a religious anomaly, it is a universal strategy. The same principles that explain why God stays unseen also explain why certain leaders dominate, why some people command respect without noise, and why others exhaust themselves trying to be visible and are still ignored. Machiavelli would say this bluntly: scarcity creates value, and visibility, when uncontrolled, destroys it. Look at the most influential figures in any domain. The ones who truly shape outcomes are rarely the most vocal, the most available, or the most transparent. They do not respond to every message. They do not explain every decision. They do not narrate their thinking in real time. They allow space between action and explanation. And that space is where authority lives. Modern culture teaches the opposite. We're told that presence equals care, that accessibility equals love, that constant communication equals honesty. Machiavelli would call this naive, because he understood that overexposure erodes power faster than opposition ever could. A leader who shares every thought invites judgment. A leader who reacts to everything loses frame. A leader who never withdraws trains others to take him for granted. But a leader who appears selectively, who withholds, who pauses, who lets silence do part of the work, forces others to orient themselves around him. God's hiddenness follows the same architecture. Think about what happens psychologically when something you value becomes scarce. Attention sharpens. Interpretation deepens. Meaning intensifies. Scarcity does not just increase desire, it reorganizes behavior. People move differently around what they cannot easily access. This is why Machiavelli warned rulers against excessive familiarity. Not because distance is cruel, but because intimacy without structure dissolves respect. When people believe they fully understand you, they stop fearing you. When they stop fearing you, they stop respecting boundaries. And when boundaries collapse, authority follows. A visible God would become familiar. Familiarity would become judgment. Judgment would become dismissal. Not because humans are evil, but because human psychology is wired that way. Machiavelli never romanticized human nature. He observed it. He saw that people crave certainty, but despise what becomes predictable. They say they want transparency, but they are drawn to mystery. They demand presence, but they lose reverence once it is guaranteed. This is why God's silence provokes obsession instead of apathy. If God were truly irrelevant, people would stop talking about him. They don't. The absence keeps the question alive. Here is the deeper twist. Machiavelli believed that power reveals itself not through force, but through restraint. Anyone can act. Only the strong can choose not to. A God who can force belief but doesn't is displaying restraint. A God who can dominate but chooses distance is expressing confidence. A God who allows doubt is demonstrating trust in the process rather than insecurity about control. This flips the emotional script entirely. The silence you experience during suffering, during confusion, During unanswered prayers, what if it is not abandonment, but refusal to infantilize? What if it is the discipline of not intervening too early, too often, too cheaply? Machiavelli would argue that leaders who solve every problem create weak followers. Leaders who step in only at critical moments create capable ones. The same principle applies here. But there is something even more unsettling beneath this. Hiddenness preserves freedom. If God were visibly present at all times, choice would be distorted. You would not choose belief, you would submit to evidence. You would not choose morality, you would comply under observation. Free will would exist in name only. Machiavelli understood that control achieved through fear is brittle. It collapses the moment surveillance disappears. Control achieved through internalization, through values chosen rather than enforced, lasts far longer. A hidden God allows belief to be voluntary. And voluntary belief is infinitely more powerful than coerced obedience. This is why faith requires risk. Risk is not a flaw in the system. It is the price of authenticity. Without the possibility of doubt, belief becomes meaningless. Without the possibility of disobedience, morality becomes hollow. Machiavelli would see this as elegant design. Not moral softness, but strategic brilliance. And here is where the lesson turns inward. Because this is not just about God, it is about you. Every time you over-explain, you cheapen your position. Every time you make yourself endlessly available, you reduce your value. Every time you remove all mystery, you eliminate tension, and tension is where influence is born. God's hiddenness is a mirror. It reflects a truth about power most people resist. Presence must be regulated to remain meaningful. Silence must be intentional to remain powerful. Distance must be disciplined to preserve respect. This is why the most compelling brands do not reveal everything. They suggest, they imply, they allow discovery. This is why the most magnetic individuals are not the ones who document every moment of their lives. They leave gaps, and those gaps pull attention toward them. Machiavelli would say, when people don't know everything about you, they think about you more. When they think about you more, you influence them more. When they orient themselves around you, you have power without ever raising your voice. A hidden God operates the same way. Not to manipulate, but to preserve meaning. Not to punish, but to sustain engagement. Not to withdraw love, but to prevent it from becoming ordinary. And this realization should disturb you, because it means the silence you resent may be the very thing keeping the relationship alive. It means the distance you interpret as neglect may actually be respect. It means the unanswered questions may be invitations, not rejections. Machiavelli would leave you with this unsettling thought. Power that explains itself constantly is already weakening. Power that remains confident enough to be silent is rarely threatened. And if that is true of God, it is certainly true of men. Now we arrive at the point most people resist, because it demands responsibility instead of comfort. If God's hiddenness is strategy, not neglect, then silence is not something done to you. It is something entrusted to you. And Machiavelli would say this is where the test truly begins. He believed that the strongest form of power is not control over others, but the ability to let others act freely and still shape the outcome. That is a terrifying kind of power, because it removes excuses. When no one is forcing your hand, your choices belong entirely to you. A hidden God removes the luxury of blaming authority. You cannot say, I had no choice. You cannot say, I was commanded. You are exposed to yourself. And exposure, not punishment, is what forges character. Machiavelli understood this in leadership. He knew that when people believe someone is constantly watching, they behave cautiously, not courageously. They follow rules, not principles. But when supervision fades, something else emerges. Real nature. Some rise, others collapse. And that distinction matters. This is why divine hiddenness is not passive. It is selective pressure. Think about it like this. A sword forged in constant protection never hardens. Only friction strengthens it. Only resistance reveals its structure. If God intervened every time you struggled, every time you doubted, every time you faced pain, you would remain spiritually untested, safe but small. Machiavelli would say that power which removes struggle creates dependence, not strength. He distrusted systems that protected people too much because protection dulls awareness. Growth requires exposure, and this reframes suffering in a way that is uncomfortable but precise. The silence during hardship is not proof of abandonment. It is proof that the situation is yours to navigate, that your judgment, your resilience, your values are being activated. A visible God would short-circuit this process. Every decision would be outsourced upward. Every moral dilemma would be solved externally. Humanity would never mature. It would only obey. Machiavelli believed that leaders who intervene constantly destroy initiative. They train people to wait instead of act, to complain instead of adapt, to depend instead of grow. A hidden God does the opposite. Absence forces development. But here is the paradox. This kind of distance only works when trust already exists. Only a power confident in its bond can afford silence. Insecure authority overcompensates with visibility. Secure authority withdraws. This is why Machiavelli said real power never begs for recognition. It doesn't need constant validation. It doesn't chase loyalty. It assumes it can survive without applause. And this is exactly why divine hiddenness feels offensive to the ego. The ego wants reassurance. It wants signs. It wants confirmation on its own timeline. Silence feels like rejection because the ego interprets distance as threat. But Machiavelli would warn you, demanding constant reassurance is the behavior of weakness, not love. Relationships collapse when one side cannot tolerate space. This is where divine hiddenness becomes the ultimate filter. Some people respond to silence by deepening their search. Others respond by walking away. The silence reveals who is capable of relationship without control. Now look at modern power structures. The most effective leaders today rarely explain everything. They maintain strategic ambiguity. They allow others to project. They let silence do half the work. The most respected individuals are not those constantly proving themselves. They are those whose absence is felt, whose presence recalibrates the room because it is not guaranteed. Machiavelli would say God follows the same rule. Presence must be rare to remain meaningful. And here is the insight that should unsettle you the most. If God were constantly visible, humanity would never learn to distinguish faith from convenience. People would follow God the way they follow gravity, not out of devotion, but inevitability. But inevitability does not produce meaning. Choice does. Hiddenness preserves the possibility of rejection, and only where rejection is possible can belief be genuine. This is why Machiavelli would see divine silence not as weakness, but as the ultimate display of confidence. A power so secure it does not need to impose itself. A love so certain it does not chase. And this returns the burden to you. When you face silence, you are not being ignored. You are being measured, not judged, but measured. Measured for depth, for patience, for internal alignment. Do you collapse without reassurance? Do you abandon meaning when answers don't arrive quickly? Or do you continue forward, shaping yourself even when no one is watching? That question is the real point of divine hiddenness. Machiavelli believed that the strongest leaders reveal themselves not when conditions are favorable, but when uncertainty removes external guidance. That is when character operates without supervision. A hidden God creates the same condition. Life without constant confirmation forces you to become someone who can act without guarantees. And that is dangerous in the best sense. Because a person who can act without certainty is no longer controlled by fear. A person who can choose values without surveillance cannot be easily manipulated. A person who can endure silence without collapsing becomes internally sovereign. This is the kind of human Machiavelli respected. Not obedient, not virtuous in performance, but disciplined in absence. And maybe that is the final provocation of divine hiddenness. It is not designed to comfort you. It is designed to mature you. The silence is not a void. It is a mirror. And what it reflects back is not God's absence, but your readiness. Which raises the question you can no longer avoid. If the silence is intentional, if the distance is strategic, if the absence is trust, then the real issue was never where God is. The real issue is who you become when no one intervenes. Here is the final reversal Machiavelli would leave you with, stripped of comfort and illusion. The question was never why God stays hidden. The real question is whether you are capable of living without being watched. Because true power does not hover. It does not rush to reassure. It does not explain itself to calm anxiety. Power waits. Power withdraws. Power allows consequence to teach what commands never could. Machiavelli understood that the highest form of authority is self-rule. When people act well only because they are observed, they are not virtuous. They are conditioned. Remove the watcher and the mask falls. Remove certainty and character is exposed. A hidden God removes the watcher. What remains is not chaos. What remains is you. This is why silence feels threatening. Without constant divine presence, excuses collapse. You cannot blame God for your fear. You cannot credit Him for your courage. You cannot delay action while waiting for signs. You must choose. You must move. You must carry the weight of your decisions without guarantees. Machiavelli would say this is where weak minds demand certainty. They beg for proof. They want belief without risk and morality without responsibility. But strong minds understand something dangerous. Certainty kills growth. It turns life into obedience. It freezes the soul in compliance. Silence forces a deeper question. Not, why won't God show Himself? But, who am I when belief is voluntary? Not, why doesn't God intervene? But, what am I becoming when no one intervenes? This is where divine hiddenness stops being theological and becomes personal. God is not absent from the world. He is absent from your justifications. And that absence is not neglect. It is trust. Machiavelli respected leaders who could step back and still shape outcomes. He distrusted those who hovered and controlled. Over-involvement creates dependence. Distance creates strength. A hidden God produces humans who must govern themselves. That is terrifying because it makes morality real. Integrity becomes voluntary. Meaning must be built, not handed down. Look closely and the pattern is everywhere. The most respected individuals do not chase validation. The most powerful leaders are not always present. Their systems function even when they are gone. The deepest relationships are not built on constant reassurance, but on trust strong enough to survive distance. Machiavelli would recognize divine hiddenness as supreme confidence. Confidence that humanity can act without being dragged. Confidence that belief can exist without force. Confidence that love does not require surveillance. This is why demanding constant divine presence misunderstands love. What you are really asking for is control, not connection. Certainty, not growth. Safety, not meaning. So when God stays hidden, He is not withdrawing care. He is refusing to infantilize. The silence is not empty. It is a threshold. On one side are those who demand certainty before commitment, proof before belief, presence before trust. They will always feel abandoned. On the other side are those who act without guarantees, who choose integrity when no one is watching, who build character in silence.